The letter was ripped out of Alara's hands before she could read the last line. "Give that back," she said, reaching for it. But Priscilla only laughed and held it higher, waving it above her head like a trophy. "An invitation to the Duke's ball," Priscilla read aloud, her voice sharp with mockery. "Do you really think this is for you?" Wren snatched it next, scanning the golden seal, the elegant handwriting, the crest of the royal house pressed into the wax. "Every household in the region received one," she said. "It says any unmarried woman of the house may attend. That includes her, unfortunately." Alara stood in the doorway of the sitting room, her hands still damp from scrubbing the kitchen floor, her hair tied back with a plain strip of cloth. She said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing with her stepsisters only made things worse. Their mother, Margaret, sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the exchange with the same cold amusement she always wore when her daughters tormented the girl she had promised, years ago, to care for. Margaret had made that promise to Alara's dying father. She had broken it slowly, piece by piece, until nothing of it remained. "She won't be going," Margaret said simply, not even looking up from her tea. "But it says any unmarried woman," Wren repeated, though she said it now with a sly smile, testing her mother, testing the game they all seemed to enjoy playing at Alara's expense. Margaret finally lifted her eyes. There was something calculating in them, something that made Alara's stomach tighten. "She may go," Margaret said slowly, "if she wants to embarrass herself in front of the entire kingdom." Alara's heart lifted for just a moment. Go. She could go. She could stand in a ballroom lit by 100 candles, hear music she had only ever heard drifting faintly from carriages passing on the road, watch a night unfold that was nothing like the ones she lived through in this house. Then she saw the look Priscilla and Wren exchanged, and the hope in her chest turned cold. "We have the perfect dress for her," Priscilla said, already moving toward the stairs, her skirts swishing with excitement. "Wren, fetch it. The one from the attic." Alara did not need to ask which dress they meant. She already knew. It had belonged to her mother, once. A beautiful gown of pale blue silk that Alara had loved as a child, before her mother passed, and before everything in her life had been taken apart and rearranged by people who did not love her. The dress had been locked away in a trunk for years, and in that time, moths and dust and neglect had done their slow, quiet damage. The silk was torn in several places. The hem was frayed. One sleeve had come apart at the seam. It was no longer a gown fit for a ball. It was barely fit for cleaning rags. Wren returned with it draped over her arms, holding it as if it were something distasteful, something she did not want to touch for longer than necessary. "Here," she said, tossing it toward Alara. "Wear this to the ball, if you're so eager to go." Alara caught the dress instinctively, her arms wrapping around the ruined silk. Up close, the damage was worse than she remembered. The bodice sagged. The color, once so vivid, had faded into something pale and lifeless. She could see her stepsisters watching her, waiting for her to cry, waiting for her to refuse, waiting for the satisfaction of watching her shrink back into the corner where they had kept her for so long. She did not give them that satisfaction. "Thank you," Alara said quietly, and she meant it, though not in the way they wanted her to. She meant it because it was, despite everything, still her mother's dress. It was still something that had once belonged to a happier time, before the world had turned so unkind. Margaret's smile faltered slightly at the calm in Alara's voice, but she recovered quickly. "The carriage leaves at 7, she said. "It will not wait for you. If you are not ready, you will walk." "I understand." That night, after her stepsisters had gone to bed, satisfied with the humiliation they believed they had arranged, Alara sat alone in the small room at the back of the house that had once been a storage closet and was now, in every practical sense, her bedroom. She spread the torn dress across her narrow bed and studied it by candlelight, running her fingers over the frayed edges, the places where the silk had given way to time. She thought about not going at all. It would be easier. She could stay home, avoid the stairs, avoid the whispers that would surely follow her the moment she stepped into that ballroom, dressed in rags, while every other woman wore silk and jewels. She could spare herself the shame. But then she thought of her father, and the way he used to tell her that a person's worth was never in the clothes they wore, but in the way they carried themselves through the world. She thought of her mother, who had once worn this very dress to dance with her father at their own wedding, radiant and unafraid, long before illness took her, and left Ilara alone with a stepmother who saw her only as a burden to be managed. Ilara picked up a needle and thread. She worked through the night, mending what she could. She could not fix the torn silk to look new again, could not undo years of neglect, but she stitched the seams closed as best she could, gathered the frayed hem into something neater, and tied a simple ribbon at the waist to hide the worst of the damage. It would never pass for a proper ball gown. It would still look old and plain beside the glittering dresses of the other guests, but it would be clean, and it would be whole, and it would be hers. By the time the candle burned low, her fingers ached, and her eyes stung with tiredness, but she felt something she had not expected to feel, a small, stubborn flicker of pride. The next morning, the house was chaos. Priscilla and Wren argued over jewelry, over hairstyles, over which shade of rouge suited their complexions best. Servants rushed from room to room, carrying gowns and shoes and ribbons, while Margaret oversaw everything with the sharp eye of a woman, determined that her daughters would outshine every other family at the ball. No one paid Ilara any attention. No one asked if she needed help preparing. She dressed alone in her small room, tying her hair back with the same care she gave to everything, smoothing the mended dress over her shoulders, and looking at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror propped against the wall. She did not look like a woman ready for a royal ball. She knew that, but she looked like herself, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. When the carriage arrived that evening, Priscilla and Wren climbed inside first, spreading their skirts wide, so there would be no room left for Ilara to sit. Margaret watched from the doorway, her arms folded, a faint smile playing at her lips. "I suppose you'll be walking then," she said. "I suppose I will," Ilara answered, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet resolve that seemed to unsettle Margaret more than any argument could have. The carriage pulled away, wheels crunching over the gravel drive, leaving Ilara standing alone in the cooling evening air. The palace was miles away, its towers just visible on the horizon, lit gold by the setting sun. It would be a long walk. Her shoes were thin, and the road was rough, and the sky was already beginning to darken toward night. She started walking anyway. The road stretched ahead of her, quiet and empty, save for the distant sound of other carriages rolling toward the palace, carrying other young women in their fine dresses, toward the same night that awaited her. Ilara did not let herself think about how she must look, trudging along the roadside in a mended gown, while others rode past in comfort. She thought instead about the music she might hear, the lights she might see, the single night that, no matter what happened, would belong to her and no one else. Somewhere ahead, past the hills and the long stretch of road, the ball was already beginning. Musicians were tuning their instruments. Servants were lighting candles by the hundreds, filling the grand hall with a warm, golden glow. And somewhere in that glow stood a man who did not yet know that his life was about to change, waiting for a night he expected to be as tiresome and predictable as every other ball he had ever attended. Ilara walked on, the hem of her mended dress brushing against the dust of the road, her heart beating with something that felt, despite everything, very much like hope. The gates of the palace rose before her, taller than anything Ilara had ever stood beneath, wrought from iron and gilded with gold that caught the last light of the setting sun. Carriages lined the drive in a long, glittering row, and from each one stepped women in gowns of every imaginable color, silk and satin catching the torchlight, jewels flashing at their throats and wrists. Ilara stood at the edge of the drive, dust on the hem of her mended dress, her shoes worn thin from the long walk, and for the first time since leaving her stepmother's house, her courage wavered. She could turn back. No one would notice if she simply disappeared into the darkness of the road and returned home, slipping quietly into her small room before anyone realized she had never truly gone inside. It would be easier. It would spare her the stares she could already feel gathering, the whispers she could already hear beginning among the guests nearby. A soft voice stopped her before she could decide. "You look as though you're trying to convince yourself to leave." Ilara turned to find an elderly woman standing beside her, small and slight, wrapped in a plain gray shawl that seemed almost out of place among the finery surrounding them. Her hair was silver and pinned simply beneath a modest cap, and her eyes, though lined with age, were remarkably clear and sharp, studying Alara with an expression that held no mockery at all. "I was only admiring the gates," Alara said carefully, unsure what to make of the stranger's directness. The old woman smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Alara feel, oddly, as though she had been seen through completely. "You were thinking of leaving," the woman said. "I have stood at the edge of many grand doors in my life, my dear. I know the look." Alara glanced down at her dress, at the mended seams and faded silk that marked her so clearly as different from every other woman arriving that evening. "I don't belong here," she admitted quietly. "Not dressed like this." "Belonging," the old woman said, "has very little to do with what a person wears, and a great deal to do with how they carry themselves through a room." She reached out and gently touched the sleeve of Alara's dress, the one she had spent the whole night repairing by candlelight. "This was mended with care. I can see the stitches. Whoever did this work loved what they were fixing." "It was my mother's dress," Alara said, surprised to find herself sharing something so personal with a stranger. "She's been gone for many years. My stepsisters gave it to me tonight to embarrass me, I think. But I couldn't bring myself to leave it in ruins." The old woman's expression softened further, something like understanding passing over her weathered face. "Then wear it proudly," she said. "Not because it is grand, but because it is honest. There is nothing inside that hall tonight, my dear, that is more valuable than honesty. Every gown in there hides something. Yours reveals everything true about you, if anyone cares to look closely enough." Alara felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she had been carrying since the moment Priscilla had thrown the tattered dress into her arms. "Thank you," she said softly. "Go on then," the old woman said, nodding toward the palace doors, where golden light spilled out onto the stone steps, and the sound of music, faint but unmistakable, drifted into the evening air. "The night is waiting, and so, I think, is someone inside." Alara did not know what the woman meant by those last words, but she found herself smiling despite her nerves, and when she looked back to thank the woman once more, she found the spot beside her empty. The old woman had vanished into the crowd of arriving guests as quietly as she had appeared, leaving Alara alone once again, but somehow lighter than before. She climbed the palace steps. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire house Alara had grown up in. Marble floors stretched in every direction, polished so brightly that the chandeliers above seemed to burn twice, once in the air and once beneath her feet. Guests moved through the space in clusters, their laughter bright and easy, their conversations filled with names of families and fortunes Alara did not recognize. She kept her chin lifted and her steps steady, though she felt the weight of curious glances settling on her as she passed, felt the way conversations quieted slightly as heads turned to take in the plain mended dress among so much silk. She did not stop walking. She did not let her steps falter. She simply moved forward, through the crowd, toward the grand doors that opened into the ballroom itself, where the true celebration was already well underway. The ballroom took her breath away. It was larger than she had imagined, larger than any room she had ever stood inside, with ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into shadow above the reach of the chandeliers. Hundreds of candles burned in silver holders along the walls, their light multiplied endlessly by mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling, so that the whole room seemed to glow from within. Musicians played from a raised platform at the far end of the hall, their instruments weaving together a melody so rich and full that Alara felt it in her chest before she consciously registered the notes. Dancers moved across the floor in swirling patterns of silk and color, their steps precise and practiced, their laughter rising above the music in bright, careless bursts. Alara stood at the edge of it all, overwhelmed, and for a moment simply watched. She spotted her stepsisters almost immediately. Priscilla wore a gown of deep crimson, her hair piled high and studded with small jewels that caught the candlelight with every turn of her head. Wren stood beside her in emerald green, fanning herself lazily as she surveyed the room with the same calculating expression her mother so often wore. Both of them were surrounded by small groups of admirers, other young women eager to be near the family that had, through careful maneuvering and Margaret's sharp social instincts, become one of the more prominent households in the region. When Priscilla's eyes finally landed on Alara, her expression shifted from surprise to something colder, something meaner. She leaned toward Wren and whispered something behind her fan, and both sisters laughed, the sound cutting through the music just enough for Alara to hear it, just enough for her to understand exactly what they found so amusing. She had expected this. She had known, walking through those palace doors, that this moment would come. Still, it stung more than she had prepared herself for, standing in the middle of a room full of strangers, while the two people who should have treated her like family laughed at her from across the floor. Alara lifted her chin higher and stepped further into the room. She did not know anyone here. She had no family connections to introduce her, no fortune to recommend her, no gown to draw admiring glances the way her stepsister's gowns did. She was, in every practical sense, invisible, in a room built entirely around visibility, around status, around the careful display of wealth and beauty that governed every royal event she had ever heard described. And yet, she found she did not want to leave. The music was too beautiful. The lights were too warm. Couples spun across the polished floor in perfect time with the music, skirts flaring outward in bursts of color, laughter, and conversation blending into a single warm hum beneath the melody. Alara let herself simply watch, let herself forget, for a moment, the mended dress, and the whispers, and the long walk that had brought her here. She did not notice, at first, the man standing near the far end of the hall, positioned slightly apart from the small crowd of nobles gathered around him, his expression carefully polite, but visibly weary, as though the evening had already worn thin despite having barely begun. Duke Alaric Sterling had attended a great many balls in his life, and every one of them had begun to feel identical to the last. The same faces, the same practiced smiles, the same daughters paraded before him by ambitious mothers, hoping to secure a title, a fortune, a future through marriage rather than affection. He had grown tired of it in a way he rarely admitted aloud, tired of conversations that revolved endlessly around his position rather than anything real, tired of dances performed not out of joy but out of calculation. His closest advisor, Edmund, stood beside him now, already listing the names of families Alaric was expected to acknowledge before the night was through, families whose daughters had been carefully positioned throughout the ballroom in hopes of catching his attention. "Lady Priscilla has expressed particular interest in an introduction," Edmund said quietly, nodding toward the cluster of guests near the center of the room. "Her family has strong connections to the eastern provinces. It would be a wise alliance." Alaric said nothing for a moment, his gaze drifting past the crowd Edmund had indicated, past the glittering circle of hopeful young women angling for his notice, toward the quieter edges of the room, where the candlelight fell softer and the crowd thinned into shadow. That was when he saw her. She stood near the window, half hidden by the curtain, dressed in a gown so different from every other in the room that it took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. It was old, mended, clearly, with careful, uneven stitches visible along the seams, faded in color, worn thin in places where newer fabric would have caught the light more brilliantly. And yet the woman wearing it stood with a stillness, a quiet dignity, that none of the glittering, calculating guests around her seemed to possess. She was not trying to be seen. She was not angling for his attention, or anyone else's. She simply watched the dancers with an expression of open, unguarded wonder, as though the music alone were enough to hold her interest completely. "Who is that?" Alaric asked, cutting off whatever Edmund had been saying about Eastern alliances. Edmund followed his gaze, frowning slightly when he located the woman near the window. "I couldn't say, Your Grace. She doesn't appear to be part of any family I recognize immediately." He paused, studying her more closely. Given her dress, I would guess she arrived with one of the lesser households. Perhaps a companion, or a distant relation brought along out of obligation. Alaric said nothing. He simply watched her, this quiet stranger who seemed entirely unaware that she had captured the attention of the one man in the room whose attention every other guest was desperately trying to win. The music shifted into a new arrangement, slower and more graceful than the last, and across the ballroom, couples began to reposition themselves for the next dance. Edmund cleared his throat gently beside him. "Your Grace, Lady Priscilla is waiting for your acknowledgement. It would be considered a significant slight if you were to overlook her family this evening." Alaric barely heard him. His eyes remained fixed on the woman by the window, on the mended dress, and the quiet, unpretentious way she held herself apart from the spectacle surrounding her, and for the first time all evening, He felt something stir in him that was entirely unfamiliar. Curiosity. Genuine, unforced curiosity. The kind he had not felt at a royal ball in longer than he could remember. He set down the glass he had been holding and began, without another word to Edmund, to cross the room. The crowd noticed him moving before Alara did. A ripple passed through the ballroom, conversations faltering mid-sentence, as guests turned to track the Duke's path across the polished floor. Whispers rose and fell like a wave moving outward from the center of the room, and within moments, nearly every eye had turned to follow him, curious to see which family, which daughter, would be granted the honor of his attention first. Priscilla straightened immediately, smoothing the front of her crimson gown, certain that he was walking toward her. Wren did the same, adjusting the emerald fabric at her shoulders, both sisters exchanging a quick, triumphant glance as the Duke drew closer to their side of the room. But he did not stop. He walked past the cluster of hopeful young women, past Priscilla's carefully arranged smile, past Wren's expectant posture, without so much as a glance in their direction, and continued toward the quiet corner near the tall windows, where Alara still stood, unaware, watching the dancers with the same open wonder she had worn since first entering the hall. Priscilla's smile faltered. Wren's fan stilled mid-motion. Around them, the whispers grew louder, more confused, as guests tried to understand where the Duke was actually headed, since surely, there was no one of consequence standing near those windows. Alara only realized someone was approaching when the murmur of the crowd shifted noticeably closer, when she felt, rather than saw, a change in the air around her. She turned, expecting perhaps a servant asking her to move aside, and found herself instead looking directly into the eyes of a man she recognized immediately, though they had never met, because his face had been described to her countless times by servants and travelers who had glimpsed him from a distance. Duke Alaric Sterling stood before her, close enough now that she could see the careful, genuine curiosity in his expression, an expression entirely unlike the polite, practiced smiles she had seen him offer other guests from across the room. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice quiet, meant only for her, though the silence that had fallen across the surrounding guests carried it further than he likely intended. "I could not help but notice that you seem to be enjoying the music more sincerely than anyone else in this room." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, and for a moment she could not find any words at all. She was aware, acutely, of the mended dress she wore, of the faded silk and uneven stitches that marked her so clearly, as different from every other woman he might have chosen to approach. She was aware of the eyes now fixed on her from every corner of the ballroom, of the stunned silence spreading outward like ripples on still water. "I've never heard music like this before, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "It would be difficult not to enjoy it sincerely." Something shifted in his expression, a small, genuine smile, replacing the polite mask he had worn all evening. "A rare answer," he said. "Most guests tell me what they believe I want to hear. You told me the truth. I didn't realize there was a difference expected of me," Ilara admitted. "I'm not accustomed to being asked." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady but not unkind, taking in the details of her appearance with none of the judgment she had braced herself to see. "May I know your name?" "Ilara," she said. "Ilara Whitmore." "Ilara," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "I am Alaric, though I suspect you already knew that." A faint smile touched her lips despite her nerves. "The whole kingdom knows your name, Your Grace. I doubt there's much value in me confirming it." He laughed then, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch even him off guard, and across the room, the whispers grew sharper, more urgent, as guests strained to understand what could possibly be so amusing about the plain, mended stranger standing near the windows. "I find," Alaric said, "that I have grown rather tired this evening of conversations that revolve entirely around titles and family names. Would you do me the honor of the first dance, Ilara Whitmore? I find I would much rather learn something true about a person than continue exchanging pleasantries with those who have already decided what they want from me before we've even spoken." Ilara's breath caught. Around them, the silence in the ballroom had become almost complete, the musicians themselves faltering slightly, as they too became aware of the moment unfolding near the windows. She was conscious, suddenly, of every eye in the room, of her stepsisters, standing frozen among the crowd, of her mended dress and worn shoes, and everything about her that marked her as unworthy of the honor being offered. But she thought, too, of the old woman at the gates, of her words about honesty being worth more than any glittering gown, and she thought of her father, who had always told her that courage mattered more than comfort. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, and placed her hand in his. The moment their hands touched, the musicians, as though released from some invisible pause, resumed playing, the melody swelling into something rich and full, as Alaric led Alara toward the center of the floor. The other dancers, still recovering from the shock of what they had just witnessed, parted slowly to make room, forming a wide circle around the couple as the music carried them into the first steps of the dance. Alara had never danced in a ballroom before. She had learned the basic steps years ago, taught by her mother in the quiet privacy of their old home, long before Margaret and her daughters had taken over every corner of Alara's life. She had not danced since her mother's passing, had not had reason or occasion to remember the careful rhythm of it, the way a partner's guidance could make even an unpracticed dancer feel graceful. But Alaric moved with such quiet confidence, such gentle patience, that within a few steps, Alara found the old rhythm returning to her, found her feet remembering what her mind had nearly forgotten. He guided her through the turns with careful attention, adjusting his pace when he sensed her uncertainty, offering small, encouraging smiles whenever her confidence wavered. "You dance beautifully," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the music. "I confess I expected far less confidence from someone who claimed not to be accustomed to attention." "I'm not accustomed to attention," Alara said. "I am, however, accustomed to hard work. My mother taught me to dance many years ago. I suppose the lesson simply needed a reason to return." "And what reason is that?" Alara hesitated, unsure how much of herself she wished to reveal to a man she had known for only a few minutes, a man whose favor could change everything about her life, or, just as easily, mean nothing at all once the night ended, and the ordinary world reclaimed her. But something about his steady gaze, about the genuine curiosity in his voice, made her want to answer honestly. "Tonight, Your Grace," she said. "I suppose the reason is tonight." They danced through the first song, and when the musicians began a second, without pause, as though sensing that neither dancer wished for the moment to end, Alaric did not release her hand. Around the edges of the ballroom, the whispers had grown into something closer to open astonishment, guests murmuring behind fans and gloved hands, trying to piece together who this mysterious woman in the mended dress could possibly be, and why the Duke, who had shown polite disinterest toward every carefully positioned daughter in the room, had chosen her, and only her, for not one dance but two. Priscilla stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, her face pale beneath her careful rouge, watching the scene unfold with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and rising fury. Beside her, Wren had stopped fanning herself entirely, her mouth slightly open as she watched her stepsister move gracefully across the floor in the arms of the most sought-after man in the entire kingdom. "That's impossible," Wren whispered, more to herself than to her sister. "That dress. That's the dress we gave her." "I know what dress it is," Priscilla hissed back, her fingers tightening around her fan hard enough that the delicate wood creaked in protest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be humiliated. Not this. Nearby, Margaret had gone very still, her cup of untouched wine held loosely in one hand, as she watched her stepdaughter dance beneath the chandeliers, watched the Duke's attention remain fixed entirely on Alara, despite the dozens of far more advantageously dressed young women scattered throughout the hall. Something cold and calculating moved behind her eyes, a swift recalculation of plans that had, until this very moment, seemed entirely secure. The song ended, and this time, when the musicians paused to prepare for the next arrangement, Alaric did not immediately release Alara's hand. Instead, he guided her gently toward the edge of the dance floor, away from the densest part of the crowd, toward a quieter space, near one of the tall windows, where they might speak without quite so many curious ears straining to overhear. "I hope I haven't caused you any difficulty," he said quietly, his expression suddenly more serious than it had been during the dance itself. "I noticed the way the room reacted. I know how quickly rumors spread in places like this." Alara glanced toward her stepsisters, still frozen in their shocked cluster near the center of the room, and felt a flicker of something that was not quite triumph, but close to it. "I've endured difficulty before, Your Grace. I suspect I can endure a little more, if it comes to that." "That sounds like a story," Alaric said, studying her with renewed interest. "One I would very much like to hear, if you're willing to share it." Alara considered him for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal, how much of her life she wished to expose to a man whose interest, however genuine it seemed tonight, might vanish entirely once the ball ended and ordinary life resumed. But there was something in his patient, attentive silence that made her want to trust him, something that reminded her, faintly, of the way her father used to listen when she spoke, as though every word she said mattered. "My father passed away when I was young," she began. "My stepmother inherited the household afterward, along with her 2 daughters. Since then, I've lived more as a servant in that house than as a member of the family. This dress," she gestured lightly toward the mended silk, "belonged to my mother. My stepsisters gave it to me tonight, torn and ruined, hoping I would either refuse to attend or arrive humiliated in front of everyone." Alaric's expression darkened slightly, though not toward her. "And instead?" "Instead, I spent the night mending it as best I could," Alara said. "I walked here alone, since the carriage left without me, and I suppose the rest, you witnessed yourself." For a long moment, Alaric said nothing, his gaze moving over her with an expression that held none of the pity she had feared, only something closer to quiet admiration. "I have met a great many people in my life who were born into comfort and privilege," he said finally, "and very few of them possess even a fraction of the resilience you've just described. I find that far more impressive than any fine gown could ever be." Alara felt warmth rise to her cheeks, unused to such open, sincere praise. "You're very kind, Your Grace." "I am very honest," he corrected gently. "There's a difference, though I understand why the two might feel similar to someone who has been shown so little of either." Before Alara could respond, Edmund appeared at the Duke's side, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes flicked briefly, pointedly, toward Alara's mended dress before returning to Alaric. "Your Grace, several families are waiting for an introduction. It would be prudent not to neglect them entirely." Alaric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained even. "Thank you, Edmund. I'll attend to my other obligations shortly." He turned back to Alara, his expression softening again. "Will you remain at the ball a while longer? I find I have far more questions than this single dance allowed me time to ask." "I have nowhere else to be tonight," Alara said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her nervousness. "The carriage that brought my stepsisters here certainly won't be waiting for me." "Then perhaps," Alaric said, "the palace can offer you a ride home this evening, once the ball concludes. I would rest easier knowing you did not have to walk that road again in darkness." Alara opened her mouth to politely decline, unwilling to accept charity from a man she had only just met, but something in his steady, sincere gaze made her reconsider. This was not pity, it was, she realized, simple decency, offered without condition or expectation, the kind of decency she had rarely encountered in her stepmother's house. "Thank you," she said instead. "I would be grateful for that." Alaric nodded, and though Edmund clearly waited, growing visibly more impatient beside him, the Duke lingered a moment longer, his eyes remaining on Alara with an expression that suggested he was already looking forward to whatever conversation might come next, whenever the evening allowed it. "Until later then," he said, and reluctantly allowed Edmund to guide him back toward the waiting crowd of hopeful families, though not before glancing back once more toward the window where Alara stood, watching him go with a feeling she could not quite name, warm and unfamiliar, and entirely new. Across the ballroom, Priscilla had finally found her voice again, though what emerged from her was less a sentence than a furious, hissed demand directed at her mother. "Do something," she whispered urgently. "This cannot be allowed to continue." Margaret's eyes remained fixed on Alara, calculating, sharp, already turning over the possibilities of what this unexpected turn might mean, and what she might still be able to salvage from an evening that had, in the span of a single dance, spun entirely outside her control. "Patience," Margaret said quietly, though there was an edge to her voice that suggested her patience, too, was wearing thin. The night is far from over. The ball continued around Ilara like a river she had somehow stepped into without drowning. She watched from the edges as Alaric moved through the obligatory introductions Edmund had arranged, greeting families with the same practiced warmth she had seen him offer at the start of the evening, though she noticed now, watching more closely, how his eyes drifted back toward her corner of the room whenever a pause allowed it. She did not approach him again. It did not feel right to intrude on his duties, and besides, she found she did not mind waiting. The music alone was enough to hold her attention, rich and layered in ways she had never experienced, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt no urgency to be anywhere else, no chores waiting, no sharp voices demanding her attention. A servant approached her quietly near the refreshment table, offering a small glass of chilled fruit punch with a polite bow that startled her, since she was so unused to being served rather than serving others. She accepted it with a murmured thank you, and the servant lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Forgive me for saying so, miss," the young man said quietly, glancing briefly over his shoulder before continuing, "but I don't believe I've ever seen His Grace look at anyone the way he looked at you tonight." Ilara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sure you're mistaken. I've served at these balls for 3 years," the servant said, a small smile touching his lips. "I've watched him greet countless young ladies with polite indifference. Tonight was different. I thought you should know, in case no one else has told you." He bowed again, and disappeared back into the crowd before Ilara could respond, leaving her standing alone with her punch and a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the drink. She did not have long to sit with the feeling, before Priscilla appeared at her side, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who wanted to seem casual, while every line of her body radiated tension. "Enjoying yourself?" Priscilla asked, her voice pitched sweetly enough that anyone overhearing would assume genuine warmth, though her eyes carried none of it. "Very much," Ilara answered simply, refusing to give her sister the reaction she was clearly hoping for. "I'm surprised the Duke spared you so much time," Priscilla continued, examining her gloved fingers with exaggerated casualness. "Men like him rarely follow through on such impulses. A dance means very little, you understand. By tomorrow, he won't remember your name." "Perhaps," Ilara said evenly. "Or perhaps he will. Either way, I intend to enjoy tonight, regardless of what tomorrow brings." Priscilla's composed expression cracked slightly, irritation flashing behind her eyes, before she smoothed it away again. "You should be careful," she said, her voice dropping lower, losing its sweetness entirely. "Mother won't allow this to continue. Whatever foolish attention you've received tonight, it ends the moment we return home. You'd do well to remember your place before you embarrass this family any further." "I think," Ilara said quietly, "that tonight has shown quite clearly whose behavior has been embarrassing, and it was never mine." Priscilla's mouth opened, then closed again, apparently unable to find a response sharp enough to match the calm certainty in Ilara's voice. She turned, and stalked away instead, disappearing back into the crowd with her skirts snapping sharply behind her. Ilara let out a slow breath, aware that her hands were trembling slightly, despite the steadiness she had managed to project. Standing up to Priscilla, even in small ways, had never come easily, not after years of being told, in ways large and small, that her feelings and her dignity mattered less than her stepsister's comfort. Across the room, she caught sight of Alaric watching her. His conversation with a visiting nobleman apparently paused as his attention drifted toward the tense exchange that had just concluded. When their eyes met, he offered a small, questioning tilt of his head, silently asking if she was well. Ilara nodded, a faint smile reassuring him, and after a moment, he returned his attention to the nobleman beside him, though Ilara noticed he excused himself from the conversation more quickly than seemed entirely polite. He crossed the room to her side within minutes. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly, his brow creased with genuine concern. "I couldn't help but notice that conversation seemed less than pleasant." "It's nothing I haven't handled before," Ilara said, though something in her tone must have betrayed more than she intended, because Alaric's expression grew more serious. "That was your stepsister," he said. It was not quite a question. "Priscilla," Ilara confirmed. "The eldest of the two." Alaric glanced briefly across the room, where Priscilla had rejoined her mother and sister near the far wall, the three of them standing in a tight cluster, heads bent together in low, urgent conversation. "I confess I find it difficult to understand how a family could treat someone so unkindly," he said, turning back to Alara. "Particularly someone as remarkable as you've proven yourself to be tonight." "You've known me for less than an hour, Your Grace," Alara said, though she could not entirely suppress the small smile his words drew from her. "I'm not certain remarkable is a fair judgment yet." "Perhaps not fully fair," Alaric agreed. "But I find first impressions, when they are this striking, rarely prove entirely wrong." He hesitated, then added, more quietly, "Would you walk with me? There's a garden terrace just beyond those doors. I find I would rather continue our conversation somewhere quieter than this hall allows." Alara glanced toward the tall glass doors he indicated, then back toward her stepmother's tight, watchful cluster near the far wall, and felt a small thrill of daring rise in her chest. "I would like that very much," she said. The terrace, when they stepped out onto it, offered a welcome relief from the noise and heat of the crowded ballroom. Cool evening air drifted across the stone balustrade, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers from the gardens below, and the sky above stretched wide and dark, scattered with more stars than Alara had ever taken the time to count. "It's beautiful out here," she said, moving toward the railing to look out over the moonlit gardens. "It's my favorite part of these events, if I'm honest," Alaric admitted, joining her at the railing. "The ballroom grows tiresome after enough years of attending balls that all begin to feel identical. But the gardens never change in quite the same way. There's something steady about them that I find comforting." They stood in companionable silence for a while, and Alara found herself, for the first time all evening, entirely relaxed, the tension of the crowded hall and Priscilla's sharp words fading into the quiet peace of the night air. "Can I ask you something?" Alaric said eventually, his voice careful, as though weighing whether the question was appropriate. "Of course. Why did you stay, tonight?" he asked. "After the way your stepsisters treated you, after everything you must have expected walking through those gates in that dress. Most people, I think, would have simply gone home." Alara considered the question seriously, watching the moonlight play across the garden hedges below. "I thought about it," she admitted. "More than once, actually. But I kept thinking about my father. He used to tell me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to move forward despite it. I think some part of me wanted to prove, if only to myself, that I could still choose courage, even after everything." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile in the pale moonlight. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Alara said softly. "I miss him every day." "I lost my own father several years ago," Alaric said, surprising her with the admission. "The weight of this title fell to me sooner than I was prepared for. I understand, perhaps better than most, what it means to navigate a difficult life while still trying to honor the values a parent instilled in you." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared loss, shared resilience, that made Alara feel closer to this man than she had felt to anyone in a very long time. "I'm sorry," she said gently, "for your loss." "And I for yours," he replied, equally gentle. They talked for a long while after that, the conversation drifting easily between lighter subjects and deeper ones, Alara sharing small memories of her mother's garden, Alaric describing the early, overwhelming days of learning to manage his duties as Duke. She found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, found the careful walls she usually kept around herself lowering, piece by piece, in the presence of someone who seemed to want nothing from her except honest conversation. Neither of them noticed how much time had passed until the sound of the ballroom doors opening drew their attention, and Edmund appeared on the terrace, his expression apologetic but firm. "Your Grace, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the closing announcements are set to begin shortly. Your presence is required inside." Alaric sighed softly, clearly reluctant to end the conversation. "Duty calls," he said, offering Alara a rueful smile, "though I find myself wishing, for perhaps the first time in my life, that duty could wait a little longer." "Go," Alara said, smiling despite the small pang of disappointment she felt at the interruption. "I'll be here." He hesitated at the terrace doors, glancing back at her one final time. "I meant what I said earlier. about the carriage ride home. Please wait for me once the ball concludes. I have a few more things I would very much like to say to you before the night ends." Ilara nodded, and he disappeared back into the golden light of the ballroom, leaving her alone on the terrace with the stars and the quiet rustle of the garden below. She did not know how long she stood there, replaying the evening in her mind, still hardly able to believe the turn her life had taken in the span of a single night. But her peace was short-lived. The terrace doors opened again, and this time, it was Margaret who stepped through them, her expression cold and purposeful, in a way that made Ilara's stomach tighten instantly. "A word, Ilara," Margaret said, her voice low and clipped, all pretense of warmth abandoned, now that they stood beyond the crowd's watchful eyes. "Of course," Ilara said carefully, straightening against the railing. Margaret crossed the terrace slowly, her gaze sweeping over Ilara with open disdain. "I don't know what game you think you're playing tonight," she said, "but I will not allow you to embarrass this family further. Whatever attention the Duke has shown you is nothing more than a passing curiosity. Men of his position do not marry servants dressed in rags, regardless of how charming they might find a single evening's conversation." "I never claimed to expect marriage," Ilara said quietly, though the words stung more than she wanted to admit. "I only wish to enjoy the ball, as I was invited to do." "And you have," Margaret said sharply. "Now the enjoyment ends. When the carriage departs tonight, you will be in it, and this ridiculous fantasy will conclude before it causes this family any further humiliation." "The Duke has already offered to send me home himself," Ilara said, lifting her chin despite the tremor she felt building in her chest. Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Then I suggest you decline that offer," she said, her voice dropping to something colder still. "Or you will find, upon your return, that there is no longer a home for you to return to at all." The threat hung in the cool night air between them, and Ilara felt her carefully maintained composure begin to waver, old fears rushing back in despite everything she had felt only moments earlier in Alaric's company. She had nowhere else to go, no other family, no savings, nothing beyond the small, cramped room that had been her only shelter since her father's passing. Margaret knew this, and she had never hesitated to use it as leverage before. But then Ilara thought of the old woman at the gates, of her words about honesty and courage, and she thought of her father's steady voice reminding her that fear should never be allowed to make her choices for her. "I think," Ilara said slowly, surprised by her own steadiness, "that I would rather face an uncertain future built on honesty than continue living a certain one built on your cruelty." Margaret's face flushed with fury, her mouth opening to respond, but before she could speak, the terrace doors opened once more, and Alaric stepped through them, his expression shifting quickly from warm anticipation to sharp concern as he took in the tension between the two women. "Is something wrong?" he asked, moving swiftly to Ilara's side. Margaret's fury vanished instantly behind a mask of polite composure, the transformation so smooth it might have fooled anyone who had not just witnessed the venom in her voice moments before. "Nothing at all, Your Grace," she said smoothly. "Simply a family matter. Ilara and I were just discussing our departure this evening." Alaric's eyes moved between the two women, clearly sensing that far more had transpired than Margaret's careful words suggested, but he said nothing further on the matter, only turned to Ilara with quiet, deliberate attention. "I hope you haven't forgotten my earlier offer," he said. "I would still very much like to see you home safely tonight, if you're willing." Margaret's composure flickered, just slightly, before she recovered it again. "That won't be necessary, Your Grace. Our family carriage is more than sufficient." "I wasn't asking you," Alaric said, his voice polite but unmistakably firm, and for the first time all evening, Margaret found herself without a ready response. Ilara looked between them, her heart pounding, and made her choice. "I would be honored to accept your offer, Your Grace," she said clearly, loudly enough that there could be no mistaking her decision. No room for Margaret to reshape the moment into something more favorable to herself later. Margaret's jaw tightened, fury and helplessness warring visibly across her expression, but with the Duke standing directly beside Ilara, there was nothing more she could say, no threat she could safely make without revealing far more about her true character than she wished the future ruler of the kingdom to witness. "As you wish," Margaret said stiffly, and turned, retreating back into the ballroom with as much dignity as she could salvage. Once she was gone, Alaric turned to Ilara, his expression gentle but questioning. "I don't mean to pry," he said carefully, but I sensed that was not simply a discussion about carriage arrangements. Ilara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, the tension of the last several minutes finally draining from her shoulders. "It wasn't," she admitted, "but I would rather not spoil the rest of this evening dwelling on it, if that's all right." Alaric studied her for a long moment, then nodded, respecting the boundary she had drawn, though the concern in his eyes remained. "Whatever happens tonight, and whatever happens after," he said quietly, "I want you to know that you will not face it alone, not if I have any say in the matter." Ilara looked up at him, moonlight catching the sincerity in his expression, and felt something settle deep within her chest, something steady and warm that she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Hope, unguarded and real. "Thank you," she whispered. Inside the ballroom, the music was beginning to slow, signaling the approach of the evening's final hour, and somewhere beyond the terrace doors, the closing announcements were about to begin, carrying with them the promise of a night that was far from finished revealing its secrets. When Alaric and Ilara returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The dancing had paused, and guests were gathering near the raised platform where the musicians had performed all evening, murmuring among themselves in anticipation of the closing announcements that traditionally marked the end of such grand occasions. Ilara felt a flicker of nervousness rise in her chest as several heads turned toward them, whispers following their entrance back into the hall. "Stay close, if you're comfortable doing so," Alaric murmured beside her. "I have a few words to offer before the evening concludes, and I would like you nearby when I speak them." Ilara nodded, though she had no idea what he intended to say, and allowed him to guide her toward the edge of the platform, close enough to hear clearly, but not so close as to draw undue attention before he was ready to speak. Edmund appeared at the Duke's side once more, his expression carefully neutral, though Ilara noticed the way his eyes flicked toward her with something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps cautious approval. "The hall is ready whenever you are, Your Grace." Alaric climbed the few steps onto the platform, and the room quieted almost instantly, hundreds of guests turning their full attention toward him, with the practiced deference expected of any gathering in his presence. Ilara remained at the base of the platform, aware of her stepmother and stepsisters standing rigid near the far wall, their expressions carefully arranged into polite interest that did not quite mask the tension beneath. "Thank you all for joining tonight's celebration," Alaric began, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "It has been, without question, one of the more memorable evenings I have had the pleasure of hosting." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd, and Alaric allowed a small smile before continuing. "I confess that I attended tonight expecting very little beyond the usual formalities," he said. "Introductions, careful conversations, the same practiced exchanges that mark every gathering of this kind. I did not expect to be surprised, and yet, I find myself standing here tonight having learned something I believe is worth sharing with all of you." The room remained utterly silent, guests leaning forward slightly, sensing that whatever came next would be far from ordinary. "Somewhere in this hall tonight," Alaric continued, "there is a woman who arrived without a grand carriage, without an escort, without a single jewel to her name. She walked here alone, along a dark and difficult road, wearing a dress that had been given to her not out of kindness, but with the deliberate intention of causing her humiliation." A murmur swept through the crowd, heads turning, searching for the woman Alaric described, though many had already guessed, having witnessed the earlier dance that had so thoroughly disrupted the evening's expected order. "And yet," Alaric said, his gaze finding Ilara's across the room, "she walked through those doors with more grace and dignity than I have witnessed from anyone in a very long time. She did not hide from the stares. She did not shrink from the whispers. She simply held her head high and reminded me, in the span of a single evening, what genuine courage looks like." Ilara felt heat rise to her face, overwhelmed by the sudden public attention, though beneath the embarrassment, something warmer bloomed in her chest as well, something like pride. "I believe," Alaric continued, "that too often, in gatherings like this one, we mistake appearance for worth, and status for character. Tonight has reminded me that the two are very rarely the same thing." He paused, his gaze steady on Ilara. "Ilara Whitmore, would you join me here?" The crowd parted as Alara moved forward, her heart pounding, climbing the steps onto the platform to stand beside him, acutely aware of every eye in the room fixed upon her mended dress, her plain, unadorned hair, the quiet dignity she had carried with her from the moment she first walked through the palace gates. "I would like to formally request the honor of courting Alara Whitmore," Alaric announced, his voice clear and unwavering, "not for any title or fortune her family might offer, for I understand now that neither exists, but for the character she has demonstrated tonight, which I believe far surpasses anything wealth or status could provide." A stunned silence held the room for a long moment before scattered applause began to rise, hesitant at first, then growing steadier as more guests joined in, until the ballroom filled with the sound of genuine approval, a rare and remarkable response to an announcement that defied every expectation the evening had begun with. Near the far wall, Margaret's composure finally shattered. "This is absurd," she said, her voice carrying sharply across the hall, despite her clear attempt to keep it contained. Heads turned toward her immediately, the applause faltering into curious silence once more. "Your Grace, forgive me, but you cannot possibly understand the full situation. That girl is not who you believe her to be." Alaric's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "And who do you believe her to be, Lady Margaret?" Margaret hesitated, clearly realizing too late that she had spoken without fully considering her words. But pride and desperation pushed her forward regardless. "She is nothing more than a servant in my household," Margaret said. "A burden my late husband left behind, one I have generously housed and fed for years, despite having no true obligation to do so." The words landed heavily across the silent hall, and Alara felt them like a physical blow, old shame rising instinctively, despite everything she had accomplished that evening. But before she could respond, Alaric spoke again, his voice edged with something colder than Alara had yet heard from him. "Generously housed," he repeated slowly. "Tell me, Lady Margaret, is it generosity that leads a woman to send a member of her household walking alone, along a dark road, while her own daughters ride in comfort? Is it generosity that provides a torn and ruined dress, deliberately intended to humiliate, while dressing your own daughters in silk and jewels?" Margaret's face paled, clearly unprepared for the Duke to possess such detailed knowledge of the evening's earlier events. "Your Grace, I assure you, there has been some misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding," Alaric said firmly, cutting her off with a tone that left no room for further argument. "I witnessed the dress myself. I have heard, from Alara's own account, the manner in which she has been treated within your household. And I have watched, throughout this entire evening, the calculated cruelty with which you and your daughters have attempted to diminish someone who has done nothing to deserve such treatment, beyond the simple misfortune of losing her father." The silence in the ballroom had turned heavy, guests exchanging uncomfortable glances, several casting openly disapproving looks toward Margaret and her daughters, who stood frozen near the wall, their carefully constructed social standing crumbling visibly before the entire assembled nobility. Priscilla, apparently unable to bear the mounting humiliation in silence, stepped forward, her voice sharp with desperation. "She is beneath this family, Your Grace. She has always been beneath this family. Whatever charm she has managed to display tonight is nothing more than a performance, a desperate attempt to escape her station through manipulation." "Manipulation," Alaric repeated, his voice quiet now, dangerously so. "Tell me, Lady Priscilla, which of you manipulated whom this evening? Because from where I stood, I witnessed a young woman walk miles along a dark road, alone, in a dress deliberately ruined by her own family, and arrive at this ball with nothing but honesty and quiet dignity. I have yet to witness a single moment of manipulation from her. I cannot say the same for the accusations I've heard tonight." Wren, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice smaller, less certain than her sister's. "We simply wanted her to understand her place." "Her place," Alaric said, turning his full attention toward the youngest sister, "appears, by every measure that matters, to be considerably higher than the one your family attempted to assign her." He paused, letting the words settle fully across the silent hall before continuing. "I believe the true question this evening reveals is not what Alara's place within your household has been, but rather what your family's true character has been throughout the years you claim to be caring for her." No one in the ballroom spoke. Even the musicians, still positioned on their platform, remained utterly still, instruments silent, as the full weight of the Duke's words settled over the gathered nobility. Margaret stood rigid, her face pale with the dawning realization that whatever social standing she had spent years carefully cultivating was, in this single moment, unraveling entirely before witnesses who would carry the story of this evening throughout every corner of the kingdom by morning. Alaric turned back to Alara, his expression softening considerably as he addressed her directly, his voice carrying warmth that stood in sharp contrast to the coldness he had just shown her stepmother. "I am sorry that tonight's celebration has become the setting for such an uncomfortable revelation," he said, "but I do not regret the truth coming to light. You deserved, long ago, to have your worth recognized by those who were meant to care for you. I only regret that it required a ballroom full of witnesses to finally see it." Alara felt tears gathering, though they were not tears of sadness, but of a relief so profound, it nearly overwhelmed her entirely. Years of quiet suffering, of swallowed grief and silenced anger, of believing herself unworthy of kindness simply because those closest to her had insisted it was true, finally, publicly, undeniably proven false. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find any words more adequate to the moment. Alaric turned back toward the silent, watchful crowd, his voice regaining its earlier authority. "I do not believe further punishment tonight would serve any useful purpose," he said. "The truth has been spoken, and I trust that everyone present will remember it accordingly. What I will say, clearly and for the record, is that Alara Whitmore will no longer reside within a household that has treated her with such deliberate cruelty. Effective immediately, she will be welcomed into my household, under my protection, for as long as she wishes to remain." Margaret opened her mouth as though to protest, then closed it again, apparently recognizing, at last, that any further argument would only deepen the damage already done to her family's reputation within the room. "Lady Margaret," Alaric continued, his tone now formal and final, "I trust you understand that news of this evening's events will travel quickly. How you and your daughters choose to conduct yourselves going forward is, of course, entirely your own affair. But I would advise a great deal more humility than has been on display tonight, should you wish to preserve what remains of your standing within this kingdom." Without waiting for a response, Alaric offered his arm to Alara, and together they descended the platform steps, leaving Margaret, Priscilla, and Wren standing alone amid a crowd that had, in the span of a single evening, witnessed the complete unraveling of a family's carefully maintained facade. The remainder of the ball passed in a blur for Alara, guests approaching throughout the final hour to offer quiet words of kindness, several noblewomen expressing open admiration for the courage she had shown, both in walking the long road to the palace and in enduring, with such grace, the painful revelations that had followed. She accepted their words with quiet gratitude, still hardly able to believe the transformation her life had undergone in the span of a single night. When the ball finally concluded, and guests began departing into the cool night air, Alaric guided Alara toward the palace's private carriage, dismissing Edmund's suggestion that a smaller, less conspicuous vehicle might be more appropriate given the circumstances. "She deserves nothing less than the finest carriage this palace has to offer," Alaric said simply, and Edmund, wisely, did not argue further. As the carriage pulled away from the palace, carrying them through the quiet countryside beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Alara looked back one final time at the glowing towers receding into the distance, at the road she had walked alone only hours earlier, filled with doubt and quiet fear. "You've grown quiet," Alaric observed gently, watching her from across the carriage. "I'm simply trying to understand how everything changed so quickly," Alara admitted. "This morning, I was scrubbing floors in a house that saw me as nothing more than a burden. Tonight, I am riding in a royal carriage, having been offered protection and courtship by the Duke himself. It feels like a dream I might wake from at any moment." Alaric reached across the carriage and gently took her hand, his expression earnest in the soft lantern light. "I promise you, this is no dream," he said, "and whatever comes next, I intend to make certain that the life you build from this night forward reflects the person you truly are, not the diminished role others have tried, unsuccessfully, to confine you to." Alara smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached fully into her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Then I suppose," she said softly, This is simply the beginning of a very different story than the one I expected to live. I hope, Alaric said, that it becomes a story worth telling for many years to come. In the weeks that followed, word of the ball spread quickly throughout the kingdom, carried from household to household, until the story of the mended dress and the quiet, courageous woman who had captured the Duke's genuine admiration became the most talked-about event in recent memory. Margaret's household, stripped of the social standing she had worked so carefully to build, found itself quietly excluded from the gatherings and invitations that had once defined her daughter's prospects. The consequences of that single evening's revelations, rippling outward long after the ball itself had ended. Ilara, meanwhile, began a new chapter within the palace walls, one built not on the fear and diminishment she had known for so long, but on genuine respect and growing affection. She spent her days learning the workings of the household she now called home, forming friendships with staff who treated her with warmth rather than resentment, and spending increasing hours in Alaric's company, their conversations deepening with each passing week into something far more meaningful than the polite exchanges expected of courtship among nobility. She kept the mended dress, storing it carefully, rather than discarding it as many might have expected. It served, she found, as a quiet reminder of the night everything had changed, not because a duke had chosen her, but because she had chosen, in the face of humiliation and doubt, to walk forward with courage, rather than retreat into the smallness others had tried to assign her. Months later, when Alaric formally asked for her hand in marriage, he did so not in a grand ballroom filled with watching guests, but in the quiet garden where they had first spoken honestly beneath the stars, the same garden that had witnessed the beginning of a connection built on truth rather than spectacle. "I love you," he told her simply, "not for the night you walked into my ballroom in a mended dress, though I will always treasure that memory, but for every quiet, honest moment since, in which you have shown me exactly who you are." Ilara, standing among the blooming flowers of the palace garden, wearing not silk or jewels but simply herself, said yes without hesitation. Their wedding, when it came, was celebrated throughout the kingdom, remembered not simply as a royal union, but as proof that a person's worth was never determined by the wealth others withheld from them, nor by the cruelty they endured, but by the quiet strength they carried forward regardless. Ilara Whitmore, once dismissed and diminished within her own home, became a duchess beloved not for her title, but for the same qualities that had first drawn Alaric's attention across a crowded ballroom floor: honesty, resilience, and a courage that no torn and mended dress could ever hide. And though her stepmother and stepsisters would spend the rest of their days watching from a distance, forever excluded from the life Ilara built for herself, Ilara found she carried no lasting bitterness toward them. Their cruelty, in the end, had led her, however unintentionally, toward a life far richer and more honest than anything she might have known otherwise. And for that strange, unexpected mercy, she found herself, against all odds, quietly grateful.